It was a cold, dismal morning in Tokyo on March 15, 1944. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara sat at his desk, staring intently at the stack of intercepted transmissions in front of him. His third cup of bitter tea, forgotten, had long since grown cold. For the past 18 hours, Kurihara and his team of top cryptanalysts had been poring over what seemed to be American Marine Corps communications from a recent operation in the Marshall Islands. They were seasoned veterans of the cryptographic wars, having cracked countless codes and ciphers from the Allied forces. But this was different. The sounds coming through the receiver were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The familiar static buzz, typically the signal of a scrambled transmission, gave way to an incomprehensible series of rhythmic bursts. At first, the team thought it was just noise, random interference. But as they listened more closely, a chilling realization began to form. The pattern was too consistent to be mere static. A few cryptanalysts exchanged looks, their faces a mask of concentration. There was something structured about these transmissions, a sequence that echoed the timing of military orders, the kind that would precede an attack. The frequency was unlike anything they had encountered in any Allied communication. Yet, the language itself, if it was even a language, was beyond recognition. There was no trace of English, French, or any of the familiar Allied tongues. It was a jumble of sounds that defied every attempt at decoding. It wasn't a dialect, and it wasn't gibberish. It was something else entirely, a mystery that seemed impossible to solve. Kurihara, a man who had seen Japan's cryptographic victories and breakthroughs, felt an unsettling sense of helplessness creeping over him. The facility he commanded, Ada Communications Unit, was one of the finest in the world, equipped with 118 radio receivers and 20 direction finders. The team had cracked the toughest of codes: American diplomatic traffic, British naval messages, even the State Department's Purple Code before Pearl Harbor. Yet, this was different. 3 years into the war, after breaking every major Allied code, they couldn't even make sense of these transmissions. The team worked in silence, but Kurihara's thoughts raced. He had been at the helm of Japan's most sophisticated signals intelligence operation, but now, for the first time, he felt powerless. The reality was that they had intercepted the only unbroken code in modern military history, and they didn't even know it yet. To understand why the Navajo language became the cornerstone of one of history's most unbreakable codes, we must first travel far from the battlefields of the Pacific to the heart of the American Southwest. For centuries, the Navajo people had preserved a language like no other, one that was intricately woven into the very fabric of their culture and identity. The Navajo language, or Diné Biçad, belonged to the Athabascan language family, a group of languages that spanned vast distances across North America. By the 1940s, there were approximately 170,000 speakers, but their homeland was confined to the sprawling 27,000 square mile reservation that covered parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. This isolation would prove to be one of the greatest advantages in the context of wartime espionage. Navajo, though rich in history and culture, was an unwieldy fortress of words, constructed over millennia. It wasn't just a means of communication, it was an extension of the people's worldview. The language was deeply verb-centered, with actions and events described through complex combinations of prefixes and suffixes. In fact, a single idea could be expressed in thousands of ways. The verbs themselves were fluid, constantly shifting depending on the context, and the entire sentence structure revolved around them. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Navajo, especially to an outsider, was its tone. Unlike English, which has a straightforward intonation, Navajo employed 4 distinct tones: high, low, rising, and falling. Each tone could alter the meaning of a word completely, making even slight mispronunciations dangerous. A small error in pitch didn't just change a word, it could render an entire sentence nonsensical. The language's phonetics were equally elusive to non-speakers. Navajo was rich with sounds that didn't exist in most languages. There were explosive, ejective stops, sounds formed by forcing air from the throat, and a series of nasal vowels that no one outside the Navajo culture could replicate. For native speakers of Japanese, who had only 5 vowel sounds, distinguishing these sounds was nearly impossible. The Navajo language's very structure made it one of the most complex and incomprehensible languages in the world, and to those who didn't speak it, it appeared as an impenetrable code. In a world where military codes were often based on mathematics, frequency analysis, or simple substitution, the Navajo language was the epitome of something far more elusive, a living, breathing code made of human experience, culture, and history. Its beauty lay in its complexity, its fluidity, and most importantly, its ability to resist being understood by anyone but the Navajo people themselves. While the Navajo language had been a powerful tool of communication among the Navajo people for centuries, its role in the Second World War would be shaped by a singular vision. That vision belonged to Philip Johnston, a man who understood the power and potential of his childhood language in ways that few others could. Born in 1892 to a Protestant missionary, Johnston grew up on the Navajo reservation, immersed in the culture of the Navajo people. By the time he was a young man, he was one of the rare non-Navajo people who could speak the language fluently. In fact, by the age of 9, Johnston was already translating his father's sermons into Navajo for the community. By 15, he had met President Theodore Roosevelt, translating for the Navajo leaders at the White House. As the United States entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Johnston found himself thinking about the military applications of his native tongue. He had read reports of Army units using Comanche speakers for communication during training exercises in Louisiana, and it sparked an idea. During World War I, Choctaw speakers had been used to relay messages in the face of German opposition, but it had been an unrefined effort. Johnston envisioned something far more sophisticated, a military code based on the Navajo language, one that would be both unbreakable and practical for modern warfare. Johnston's concept was revolutionary. He saw in Navajo the perfect solution to the growing problem of secure communications. The complexities of the language, its unique sounds, and its structure made it a code that could not be easily deciphered. But Johnston's idea went beyond just using the language as is. He knew it would need to be adapted for wartime needs, creating a code that was fast, secure, and easily memorized by those who spoke the language. On February 28, 1942, Johnston presented his idea to Major General Clayton Vogel at Camp Elliott, near San Diego. He demonstrated the potential of his plan in a way that was both simple and profound. 4 Navajo speakers transmitted messages using their native tongue, and Marine officers timed the transmissions against the standard encrypted methods in use at the time. The results were staggering. The Navajo speakers completed their transmission in just 20 seconds, while the M209 cipher machine, a standard encryption tool, would take 30 minutes to do the same. Impressed by the efficiency and security of the code, General Vogel immediately authorized a pilot program. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo men were sworn into the United States Marine Corps at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. These men, many of whom had grown up on the reservation and faced harsh cultural repression, were now enlisted in a mission that would change the course of the war and history. The task before the 29 Navajo recruits was monumental. At Camp Elliott, hidden away in a secure, locked building, they faced the challenge of creating a military code out of their native language, an intricate and complex task that would require both cultural insight and creativity. This was not just about translating words into code, it was about crafting a system that could withstand the harsh scrutiny of wartime intelligence. For these men, the code would need to be more than just secure. It had to be efficient. Every single transmission had to be fast, reliable, and easily memorized. There could be no room for mistakes. The terms they created would need to stand the test of time, and it would have to be something that no enemy could break. What seemed like an insurmountable task would soon begin to take shape through their unwavering focus. Their approach was rooted in their own culture. The code was built with metaphors drawn from their everyday lives, giving it a unique and intuitive quality. A submarine became beshto, or ironfish, a creature that swam beneath the surface. A battleship was twaa, meaning whale, the largest animal of the ocean. Fighter planes, fast and nimble, were called da, or hummingbirds, darting through the air. Bombers circling before a descent were represented as jaysho, or buzzards. The genius of the code lay in its simplicity and cultural logic. Each term was directly tied to Navajo traditions and natural imagery, making the code more memorable and impossible to decipher without deep cultural knowledge. But the task was far from finished. The Navajo alphabet had to be adapted to include military terms, with each letter needing multiple Navajo words to ensure that no patterns could emerge in the transmissions. For instance, the letter E, the most common in English, would be represented by 4 different words: emia, emia. These random combinations destroyed any possibility of frequency analysis. As they drilled the code, the men learned its intricacies. Every transmission had to be perfect. Chester Nez, one of the original code talkers, recalled the intensity of their training. We drilled endlessly. A mistake could cost lives. In our culture, words have power. Speaking correctly was sacred. The first real test of the code came at the Battle of Guadalcanal in August 1942. 15 Navajo Code Talkers landed with the 1st Marine Division, ready to put their training to the ultimate test. The Japanese, confident in their ability to decode Allied communications, had anticipated the attack. But when the Marines began transmitting tactical messages, the enemy was caught off guard. What the Japanese heard was an incoherent jumble of sounds, utterly incomprehensible and impossible to break. At Japanese headquarters, Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, who had studied at Stanford before the war, reported his team's frustration. The sounds are structured like language, with consistent patterns, but it matches nothing. Not English, French, Dutch, Spanish, any Philippine dialect. Nothing. It's completely alien. Despite all their efforts, the Japanese cryptographers failed. The Navajo Code had proven to be an impenetrable fortress, rendering the enemy's cryptographic methods powerless. For the first time, Japan's intelligence apparatus had encountered something they couldn't crack. The Japanese response to the American code was swift and methodical. Once they realized that the Marines' communications had become completely unintelligible, their cryptographers launched an all-out offensive to decode what they had intercepted. They called upon their most skilled analysts, who worked tirelessly, recording every transmission, analyzing it from every possible angle. But no matter what approach they tried, the result was the same: failure. For months, they listened to the radio signals, hoping to catch a break, but the more they examined, the more elusive the language became. They analyzed the rhythm of the transmissions, consulted experts in linguistics, and even consulted Buddhist monks who studied ancient languages for insights into the strange patterns they were hearing. But still, they could make no sense of it. The Japanese intelligence community was baffled. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, one of their top cryptographers, had been educated at Stanford before the war and had an exceptional understanding of language. Yet, as he sat in front of the transmissions, he couldn't break through. "The structure is like a language, consistent and patterned," he reported. "But we cannot identify any dialect, not English, not French, not any Philippine dialect. This is something entirely foreign." The frustration reached a boiling point when they turned to their last hope, a captured American soldier Joe Kalamuya, a Navajo man who had been captured during the Bataan Death March in April 1942, was brought to the Ada Interrogation Center in Tokyo. His fluency in Navajo was hoped to give them the edge they needed. After all, they reasoned, who better to help decode the transmissions than a native speaker? But when Kalamuya was played, the intercepted messages, he could only shake his head. The words were familiar, but their military context was completely foreign to him. The phrases made no sense. The turtle is attacking the iron fish. One message read, but to him it was nothing more than a nonsensical jumble of words. The hummingbird carries eggs, was another. The Japanese interrogators, frustrated by their inability to get the answers they sought, accused Kalamuya of lying. They subjected him to months of brutal torture, waterboarding, beatings, and even hanging him by his arms for hours. They used every method at their disposal to break him, but through it all, Kalamuya held firm. He could only repeat the truth. He understood the language, but he didn't understand the military meanings behind the words. The torturers grew desperate, forcing him to stand naked in the snow until his feet froze to the ground, starving him to 90 pounds, offering him food in exchange for translations. Despite their relentless pressure, Kalamuya never wavered. He was a man of honor, a man of his word, and he did not betray his people's sacred language. By May 1943, after more than a year of exhausting efforts, Japanese intelligence was forced to acknowledge that they were up against something they had never seen before, a code so intricate and so alien that no one, no matter their training or expertise, could crack it. In a report filed in May 1943, Japanese intelligence officers noted their exasperation. The prisoner appears native to the mystery language but cannot comprehend messages. It is either extraordinary resistance or the enemy uses a specialized code within a native language requiring specific training. Their second assessment was spot on. Even a fluent Navajo speaker couldn't understand the intricacies of the code without proper training. The Japanese had reached a dead end, and with that, the true magnitude of what they were facing became clear. The Navajo Code was, indeed, unbreakable. As the war raged across the Pacific, the Code Talkers' role evolved from a revolutionary concept to an irreplaceable tactical asset. Their first trial by fire came at Guadalcanal, where 15 Navajo Code Talkers landed alongside the 1st Marine Division in August 1942. The Japanese had anticipated the invasion, having successfully decoded many Allied messages. But what they didn't anticipate was the mysterious, unbreakable communications that the Marines now employed. As the Code Talkers transmitted orders and strategic messages, the Japanese intelligence officers on the other side of the world were left in confusion. What they heard was indecipherable. Every message, every transmission was just a string of incomprehensible sounds, completely foreign to anything they had ever encountered. The Japanese military, which had relied on cryptanalysis to predict and counter Allied operations, suddenly found itself blind. The tactical advantage that came with understanding the enemy's plans was stripped away. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, in a moment of rare admission, confessed to his superiors, "The Americans have deployed a code that defeats every attempt. We can no longer anticipate attacks. We are fighting blind." At Guadalcanal, the Marines' success was built on the shoulders of these silent warriors who communicated with the speed and precision that no cryptographic machine could match. The Japanese were left scrambling, their once reliable intelligence apparatus now powerless against the mysterious transmissions from the battlefield. The Code Talkers' critical role didn't stop at Guadalcanal. In November 1943, during the brutal battle for Tarawa, 6 Code Talkers were stationed in the heat of the conflict, relaying messages for 76 continuous hours. Despite constant shelling and perilous conditions, these men remained steadfast, their transmissions a lifeline for the Marines fighting in the thick of combat. One of the standout moments came when Lloyd Oliver, a Code Talker, transmitted for nearly 48 hours, coordinating naval gunfire despite the constant barrage of enemy shells. The rapid transmission of battlefield intelligence, combined with the code's security, ensured that American forces could adjust their tactics in real time, keeping the Japanese off balance. During the Mariana Islands campaign, the Code Talkers continued to prove their worth. At Saipan, 24 of them operated round the clock, transmitting vital coordinates and tactical orders, ensuring that the marine assault remained coordinated despite the chaos of battle. Even though the Japanese had cracked some conventional communication methods, the Navajo Code remained impervious to their best efforts. The Marines began to recognize the true value of their code talkers. The same cryptographers who had once been tasked with breaking the enemy's codes now relied on these men to maintain the flow of secure communications. The Navajo Code was faster than any cipher machine, and unlike traditional encryption methods, it had no weaknesses, no keys to crack, no patterns to exploit. The significance of their work became undeniable. When the Japanese began to shift their focus to breaking the Navajo Code in late 1943, they realized they were up against something unprecedented. The Code Talkers had proven that the power of language, of culture, could be a far stronger weapon than any machine, and far more enduring. The end of the war brought victory, but it also left behind a heavy burden for the Navajo Code Talkers. Their contributions, though invaluable, were shrouded in secrecy. For years, they returned home as heroes, yet their stories went untold. They had fought in the war, contributing in ways that no one could fully understand, except, perhaps, their fellow Marines. But in a time of national celebration, the men who had helped win the war were forced to live with silence. The U.S. government had gone to great lengths to keep the Code Talkers' role under wraps. Their success was classified, and their work was hidden in plain sight. Even when they returned home, the Navajo Code Talkers were bound by an oath of secrecy. They could not speak of their contributions. The very language they had used to secure victories for their country became a taboo subject. This was not the only hardship they faced. Despite their service, many of the Code Talkers returned to communities that did not offer the recognition or respect they deserved. They returned to states that had denied them basic rights, such as the right to vote, until 1948 in New Mexico and Arizona, and even later in Utah. Their service in the military did not shield them from the harsh realities of discrimination. The very country they had helped to defend had failed to welcome them home. Even more painful was the fact that for years their story remained a secret. The Navajo Code Talkers returned to lives where their heroism went unacknowledged. Their incredible contribution, changing the course of the war with their unique Unbreakable code, was a story they could not share. They were, in the eyes of the world, anonymous warriors. It wasn't until decades later that the Code Talkers began to receive the recognition they had earned. The first public acknowledgement came in 1968 when the program was declassified. But true recognition came slowly. In 1969, at a reunion of the 4th Marine Division, the men who had once been silent began to speak, albeit quietly. For the first time, their efforts were recognized by those who understood the gravity of what they had done. The most significant honor came in 2001, when President George W. Bush awarded the original 29 Code Talkers the Congressional Gold Medal in the Capitol Rotunda of the original 29. Only 5 remained alive to attend the ceremony. As President Bush stood before them, he said, "Today, we honor 29 Native Americans who gave their country a service only they could give." Chester Nez, one of the surviving Code Talkers, summed up the weight of the moment. "We were ordinary men given an extraordinary task. We used our sacred language to help win the war. And now, finally, people can hear our story." But the recognition did not erase the years of struggle. It didn't erase the pain of returning home to a country that had kept their heroism hidden, and it didn't erase the sense of isolation that many of them felt. However, it did provide something they had long been denied: acknowledgement. Their story had been kept in the shadows for far too long, but at last it would be heard. The legacy of the Navajo Code Talkers extends far beyond their remarkable role in World War II. Their contributions not only changed the course of history, but also reshaped the way the world viewed Native American languages and cultures. What had once been a tool for war became a symbol of cultural pride and resilience, proving that indigenous knowledge, long disregarded or suppressed, had a place in modern society. Their story is one of perseverance, of using their native language, once suppressed by schools and institutions that sought to erase it, to secure the future of their nation. The very language that had been targeted for extinction became the key to victory, not just in the Pacific Theater, but in the larger fight for recognition and respect. Their success was a powerful statement. The strength of a culture lies in its people, in its language, and in the resilience to hold on to both, even in the face of adversity. After the war, as the Code Talkers returned to civilian life, they faced challenges beyond the battlefield. They returned to a society that had long tried to erase the significance of their cultures, but they carried with them the profound knowledge that their language had helped win the war. Over time, the story of the Code Talkers grew into a powerful narrative of resistance and survival, representing the enduring strength of Native American communities. In the decades following the war, the Navajo Code Talkers became symbols not only of military prowess, but of the ongoing struggle to preserve Native American languages and traditions. The code, which had been a tactical asset, became a living testament to the adaptability of indigenous cultures. In 1968, the program was declassified, and their role in the war slowly began to be acknowledged. But it wasn't until 2001 that their bravery was truly recognized with the awarding of congressional gold medals to the original 29 Code Talkers. Today, the legacy of the Navajo Code Talkers continues to resonate, both within the Navajo Nation and in broader American society. Native American communities, once marginalized, now look to the Code Talkers as examples of pride and strength. The language that was once suppressed is now celebrated and taught in schools, with new generations of Native Americans embracing their cultural heritage. The Navajo Code Talkers proved that their language was not a relic of the past, but a vital force capable of standing up to the most sophisticated military strategies in the world. They demonstrated that differences, whether in language, culture, or background, are not weaknesses but strengths. Their story is one of unity in diversity, a reminder that America's true strength lies not in its uniformity, but in its diversity. As the last of the original Code Talkers pass into history, their legacy endures in every Navajo speaker, in every Native American child learning their ancestral language, and in every person who understands that the diversity of cultures and languages is not just something to preserve, but something to celebrate. The Navajo Code Talkers showed the world that diversity is not only a strength, but the very key to unlocking the future. The war had ended, but the fight for recognition was far from over. For the Navajo Code Talkers, returning to their homeland after the devastation of battle was a bittersweet experience. Their memories of the Pacific, where they had fought fiercely for the freedom of a country that had not yet recognized them, lingered as they stepped back into the quiet, dusty streets of the Navajo Nation. They had won the war, but at what cost? Some of them returned to lives that had been shaped by years of struggle and hardship. They had left the reservation as young men, filled with pride and hope, but they returned as veterans, warriors, who had experienced the unimaginable. Many had lived through the horrors of battle, carrying scars both visible and invisible. But while the war was over, the true challenge for the Code Talkers was their reintegration into civilian life. In the military, they had been given a task, a purpose. But in their homeland, their role as Code Talkers was not yet known. There were no grand celebrations, no ticker-tape parades for these men who had secured the nation's victory. In fact, they returned to a world where the outside world still viewed Native American culture as something backward, something to be forgotten or erased. However, The Navajo Nation itself began to see the Code Talkers as heroes. The pride they felt was deeply personal, a recognition that the sacred language they had spoken, the very language that had been suppressed for generations, had been the key to victory. It wasn't just a language anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of survival. For many of the Code Talkers, returning to their roots offered a sense of peace. They would gather with their families, share stories of their experiences, and teach their children the importance of preserving their cultural heritage. They had proven to the world that the Navajo language was not a weakness, but a strength. It was a living force, a code that no one could break. The echoes of their wartime efforts rippled through their communities, inspiring future generations to embrace their heritage. As the years passed, the significance of their contributions became more apparent, not just to the Navajo people, but to the world at large, and though the men themselves were aging, their legacy would continue to shine brightly. The legacy of the Navajo Code Talkers grew beyond the walls of history books and military archives. It became a beacon of cultural resurgence. Their service during World War II had proved, once and for all, that the Navajo language was not a relic of the past to be forgotten, but a living, breathing testament to the strength of indigenous cultures. As the decades passed and the Code Talkers' story was slowly uncovered, it sparked something much greater than national recognition. It ignited a cultural renaissance among Native American communities, a resurgence of pride in their languages, traditions, and histories that had long been suppressed. The Navajo Code Talkers had shown that their language could stand strong in the face of the most advanced military forces in the world. They had taken something sacred to their people and turned it into a powerful weapon of victory. In the post-war years, Native American communities had been wrestling with their place in a modern America that often saw them as a fading part of history. Native languages were increasingly endangered, with the younger generations choosing English as the primary means of communication. Cultural practices, once vibrant, were dying out as modernity encroached on ancestral ways. But the story of the Code Talkers, of men who used their language to alter the course of history, became a rallying cry for a new era of cultural pride. Across the country, Native American communities began to recognize the value of their languages. Schools on reservations, where once speaking Navajo had been punished, now started teaching it as a way to preserve their heritage. Young people who had never heard their elders speak their native tongues began to learn. This cultural revival was not just a matter of pride, but a matter of survival. The Navajo language, once an object of shame and repression, became an emblem of resistance. The Code Talkers had proven that indigenous languages were not primitive or outdated. They had proven that these languages were powerful, capable of serving their people in ways no one had ever imagined. As the world began to acknowledge the Code Talkers' contributions, the larger Native American community took notice. Other tribes who had their own languages saw the potential for revitalization, realizing that the Navajo Code was not a unique anomaly, but a model for preserving their own cultural wealth. In the years following the declassification of the program in 1968, more Native American languages received attention. The Code Talkers' story inspired a broader movement to reclaim and protect these languages. The recognition of the Code Talkers also helped shift the American public's perception of Native American culture. No longer relegated to the past, Native Americans were now seen as active, contributing members of society with valuable skills, wisdom, and resilience. The declassification of their role in the war served as a reminder that while the United States had long sought to erase their languages, it was those very languages that had helped secure the nation's victory. The Code Talkers became symbols of the profound power of indigenous cultures. This shift wasn't without its challenges. Although the world now recognized the importance of the Code Talkers' language, Native communities continued to face discrimination and marginalization. Yet, as the Code Talkers had done during the war, Native Americans were proving their resilience in the face of adversity. The Navajo Code Talkers had set the stage for a new generation, one that would stand proudly, speaking their languages and living their traditions, not as relics of the past, but as vibrant symbols of the future. In this cultural renaissance, the Navajo Code Talkers stood not just as warriors who helped win a war, but as pioneers who showed the world that indigenous cultures, far from being defeated, were a living, evolving testament to the strength and endurance of human diversity.